The day the fence crossed onto my land was not the day I noticed it, but the day I woke up to the sound of a metal post driver slamming into the earth like it owned the place, and I remember standing there in my bare feet holding a coffee that suddenly tasted wrong, while an HOA contractor smiled at me and said, "This will only take a minute, sir," as if minutes were the currency of theft and not acres, because in that moment I realized something was very wrong and also very deliberate and also very funny in a way that makes your stomach tighten, because when someone is bold enough to take land in broad daylight with a clipboard and a logo, you know you are either about to be steamrolled or about to enjoy the longest, most satisfying argument of your life. I had bought the property 3 years earlier because it was the one place in the county where the HOA boundary technically ended at a crooked line that followed an old creek bed, and that crooked line was the reason the lot was cheaper and the reason I could park equipment there without being told what shade of green was acceptable for grass, because I had read the covenants carefully, and so had my lawyer, and the survey pins were still bright when I moved in, and I kept the paperwork in a fireproof box like a man who knows someday someone will pretend not to remember what was agreed upon. The fence itself started as a rumor when a neighbor mentioned the HOA wanted uniformity along the back lots, and I laughed, because uniformity stops where deeds begin, and I said as much, but a week later bright orange paint appeared on the ground in a line that cut through my wild grass like a bad haircut, and when I asked the foreman what the markings were, he shrugged and said plans change, which is what people say when they hope you do not ask whose plans and who approved them and why they forgot to invite the person who actually owns the dirt. I called the HOA office and was told the board had voted unanimously, which is a phrase that sounds impressive until you realize none of them live on my side of the line, and that the fence was for community safety and aesthetics, and I said safety from what exactly, deer and grasshoppers, and the woman on the phone laughed like it was a joke we were sharing until I asked her to email me the survey they were using, and the laughter stopped and turned into a promise to follow up. While waiting, I walked the property with my own survey from closing folded like an old map, and I checked the pins and the distances and the angles, and everything matched exactly what I remembered and exactly what the HOA fence did not match at all, and that is when I noticed the contractor had set the first post almost 4 feet inside my lot, and that 4 feet ran the entire length of the boundary, which in county terms is not an accident but an expansion. The email finally arrived with a glossy attachment from a surveying firm I had never heard of, and the line was straight where mine was crooked, and that straightness was very convenient because it shaved off a slice of my land like a bad haircut again, and handed it to the HOA as if nature itself had always intended it that way, and I felt the strange calm that comes when someone lies badly because it means the truth will hurt them later. I replied politely and attached my deed, my plat, my survey, my closing documents, and a photograph of the original county pins still in place, and I asked them to stop construction until the discrepancy was resolved, and the response was immediate and sharp, saying construction would continue as scheduled, and that any interference would result in fines, which was the moment the situation went from annoying to interesting. By the next morning the fence line had grown like a bad idea, with metal posts marching across my grass and neighbors slowing their cars to watch, because nothing draws a crowd like quiet conflict, and I stood there again with coffee now cold while the foreman avoided my eyes, and the sound of the driver echoed like a heartbeat, and I thought about how many times I had heard stories where the calm person loses because they hesitate, and how many times the loud person loses because they overreach, and I decided I would do neither. I hired my own surveyor that afternoon, a man who still uses a level older than both of us, and who laughed when he saw the HOA map, and said this is creative, and then put flags exactly where the boundary actually was, and those flags cut directly through the shiny new posts like a line of truth nobody wanted to see, and I sent photos to the HOA board and asked again for a pause. Instead of a pause, I got a notice of violation for obstructing community improvements and a warning about legal action, and that was when the humor finally arrived, because there is something deeply funny about being threatened for defending land you can trace back to the county books, and I laughed out loud alone in my kitchen, and set the notice next to my paperwork, and realized this was no longer about a fence but about whether bullies with letterhead "Get rewarded for confidence." By sunset the fence was nearly complete, and the line was wrong, and the tension was thick enough that even the birds kept their distance, and I knew Chapter 1 of this story was ending whether the HOA realized it or not, because once a boundary is crossed physically and legally and emotionally, there is no quiet way back, and as I watched the last post go in, I made a call not to a lawyer, not to the county, but to the equipment yard to reserve something very large, very loud, and very patient, because arguments like this are only finished one way, and the bulldozer was about to enter the conversation. The next morning the fence stood there like it had always belonged exactly where it was planted, and that illusion was the most insulting part, because land theft only works if people stop believing their own eyes, and I refused to do that, so I started the day by doing something the HOA clearly did not expect, which was absolutely nothing dramatic at all, because instead of yelling or calling the sheriff or threatening lawsuits, I made copies of every document I had and drove to the county office, where the clerks know every boundary dispute before it even happens, and where maps are treated like scripture, and when I laid my plat on the counter, the woman behind the glass did not even need to measure twice before she sighed, and said this again, and that single word again told me everything I needed to know, because it meant the HOA had pulled this move before, and it had not gone well for them then either. I requested a certified boundary confirmation, which is not fast but it is final, and while the paperwork crawled through the system, the HOA accelerated in the opposite direction by mailing notices to my neighbors claiming the fence was a community improvement and hinting that resistance would delay shared amenities, which is how bullies recruit crowds, and I could feel the pressure shifting as a few friendly waves turned into cautious nods, and one neighbor even stopped me to say he hoped I was not causing trouble, and I smiled and told him trouble usually announces itself with a fence and a clipboard, and he laughed nervously and walked away like he had just realized he picked the wrong side of a quiet war. 2 days later, a bright yellow notice appeared on my door stating I was in violation for tampering with survey markers, which I had not done, and for obstructing contractors, which I also had not done, and it listed fines that escalated daily like a slot machine of nonsense, and I pinned the notice to my corkboard next to the others and labeled the section evidence, because by then I was no longer reacting, I was documenting, and that shift is important, because once you start documenting you stop feeling helpless and start feeling curious. The HOA president finally showed up in person, flanked by another board member and a man in a polo shirt who introduced himself as legal counsel, and they stood just inside my property line like tourists afraid to cross a border, and the president spoke in a voice meant to sound calm but came out rehearsed as she explained that the fence placement had been reviewed extensively and that any further dispute would need to be resolved through proper channels, which is what people say when they are hoping you will get tired before the paperwork does. And I listened without interrupting, because silence makes liars nervous, and when she finished I asked a single question, which was whose survey did you use, and she named the firm again, and I nodded and asked whether that firm had pulled county pins or relied on HOA supplied reference points, and the lawyer cleared his throat and said that level of detail was not necessary, and that was when I knew they were in trouble. That afternoon my surveyor returned with printed maps and photographs and a confidence that comes from knowing the earth does not care about bylaws, and we walked the line again, and he explained exactly how the HOA survey had straightened a natural curve to simplify measurements, and how that simplification conveniently gifted them land, and how no judge would accept it, and I recorded the explanation on my phone, not to post online. Not to threaten but to remember, because truth sounds different when spoken plainly, and I wanted that sound preserved. The tension in the neighborhood escalated as the fence finished curing and suddenly became real and permanent and ugly, and one neighbor actually applauded when he saw it, claiming it made the area look cleaner, and that comment hurt more than the notices, because it reminded me how easily people accept injustice when it benefits them slightly and costs them nothing, and that night I slept poorly, not because I doubted my position but because I could see exactly how this would end, and I knew the middle part would be loud. The certified letter from the county arrived 3 days later confirming the original boundary exactly as my documents showed and declaring the HOA fence encroached onto private property and recommending immediate correction, and I read it twice, and then once more slowly because this was the moment everything changed, and I sent a copy to the HOA with a polite note stating construction must be reversed within 10 days and that no further communication was necessary, and the response came within an hour, not with agreement but with a threat of injunction, which is the legal equivalent of a tantrum. At that point the HOA stopped pretending this was administrative and started treating it like a dominance contest by posting notices on community boards warning of rising costs due to a single uncooperative owner and using my name without permission and exaggerating the situation into something theatrical, and I watched neighbors whisper and speculate, and I realized the HOA was betting I would fold under social pressure, which would have worked on a younger version of me, but this version had already reserved a bulldozer and knew exactly how patient heavy machinery can be. By the end of the week the sheriff paid a courtesy visit not because of a crime, but because the HOA wanted a presence, and the deputy walked the line with me, looked at the paperwork, and said off the record this is not going the way they think it is, and then advised everyone to keep things civil, which is code for do not make me come back with more paperwork, and as he drove away I stood alone by the fence and felt something settle into place. Not anger, not excitement, but certainty, because once authority sees the truth it does not unsee it, and the HOA had just pushed this argument past the point where apologies work and into the territory where consequences arrive slowly, loudly, and in reverse direction. By the time the injunction threat landed in my mailbox the situation had ripened into something almost educational because the HOA was no longer arguing facts but momentum, and momentum is only impressive until it hits a wall, and I could feel them rushing, because rushing is what people do when they realize the paperwork is against them and they hope speed will blur reality, and I responded by slowing everything down, which is a skill learned the hard way over years of dealing with contractors, permits, and people who think authority is louder than evidence, and I sent a single letter back attaching the county confirmation again and stating that any further encroachment would be treated as trespass, and that communication should now be routed through council, and I did not name my council yet, which annoyed them far more than any threat would have. The neighborhood responded the way neighborhoods always do when a conflict turns public, by choosing sides quietly and pretending not to, and I noticed who stopped waving, and who suddenly wanted to chat, and who asked questions that were not really questions but invitations for gossip, and I answered everyone the same way by calmly explaining the boundary and the documents and the county ruling, and by refusing to sound angry because anger would have given them something to point at and say, see that is the problem, and instead my calm forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that maybe the HOA had overstepped and maybe they had cheered too early. The HOA escalated again by scheduling an emergency board meeting and posting a notice that residents were encouraged to attend and voice concerns, which translated into bring pitchforks politely, and I attended not because I needed to but because silence is only powerful when you have already been heard, and I sat in the back while the president spoke at length about community values and shared spaces and the cost of dissent, and when it was finally my turn to speak I held up the county letter and read it aloud slowly, and the room changed, because paper has weight, and when you hear it read calmly it lands differently, and someone in the front row asked why the fence was not moved already, and that was not a question the board had prepared for. After that meeting the tone shifted from confident to defensive, and defensive people make mistakes, and the next mistake was sending a contractor back onto my land to inspect the fence line without notice, which turned a civil dispute into a legal one, and I documented the entry with photographs, timestamps, and a call to the sheriff non-emergency line, and when the deputy arrived, he was the same one from before, and he shook his head and told the contractor to leave, and wrote a note that would later become very important, and the contractor left muttering about just following orders, which is the phrase history remembers poorly. Behind the scenes, my lawyer entered the picture quietly and efficiently and sent a cease and desist that referenced statutes, case law, and previous county actions against the same HOA, and that letter did not threaten loudly, it simply outlined consequences and timelines, and that is often more frightening because it suggests confidence and preparation, and the HOA responded with silence for a full day, which was the first real silence since this began, and silence from an aggressor is never peace. It is calculation. That calculation produced a new tactic, which was fines multiplied and notices posted and rumors circulated that I was planning something drastic, and that rumor part was not wrong, but it was vague enough to let imaginations do the work, and I let it because fear thrives in vagueness, and I wanted them uneasy without giving them anything actionable, and while they speculated, I finalized logistics, confirmed equipment availability, checked access routes, and verified that every step I was about to take would be legal, boring, and devastating. The Bulldozer reservation sat quietly on my calendar like a secret, and I went about my normal routine, mowing what grass I could, repairing a gate, and waving to neighbors who now watched me like a chessboard, and I could sense the HOA waiting for me to explode, to do something reckless that would justify their narrative, and I denied them that satisfaction by being relentlessly normal, because nothing unsettles control freaks like a target who refuses to act on their schedule. Midweek, the HOA lawyer finally called mine, proposing mediation, which is often code for "we need you to stop, because this is about to get expensive," and the offer included moving the fence slightly and waiving fines, and I declined through counsel, because slightly is not a measurement recognized by county records, and because waiving fines for violations that never existed is not a concession, it is an insult. And when the response came back sharper and more urgent, I knew they had reached the point where pride and panic were fighting and panic was losing. The final straw arrived in the form of a notice posted on my property claiming imminent action would be taken to secure community assets, which was vague, threatening, and unsupported, and my lawyer laughed when he read it and said, "They are trying to scare you into freezing," and I smiled, because freezing is only a problem when you are undecided, and I was not undecided at all, because the county letter, the deputy report, and the survey maps all aligned into a single clear picture, and that picture showed a fence that did not belong where it stood. As the sun set that evening, I walked the line again alone and placed small unobtrusive markers where the true boundary lay, not to move anything yet, but to visualize what would soon be corrected, and I felt a strange mix of anticipation and calm, because the argument phase was ending and the action phase was beginning, and I had learned long ago that when you have exhausted polite words, documented facts, and official channels, the most responsible thing left to do is enforce reality, and reality does not negotiate, it simply arrives, and the sound it makes is unmistakable. The morning the Bulldozer arrived was quiet in the way important mornings always are, because tension has a way of flattening sound, and even the birds seemed to wait as the lowboy trailer rolled in slow and deliberate and parked exactly where my driveway widened, and when the operator climbed down he did not ask questions, because professionals rarely do when the paperwork is clean and the instructions are clear, and I handed him a folder thicker than his glove and told him we would wait for the final confirmation from my lawyer before touching anything, and he nodded like a man who understands patience, because heavy machines teach you that rushing breaks things. The HOA learned about the equipment within minutes, because nothing travels faster than panic in a community built on gossip, and my phone lit up with messages that were not really messages but emotional weather reports ranging from concern to outrage to sudden friendliness, and I answered none of them, because this phase required quiet, not explanation, and when the HOA president finally arrived in person again, she was flanked by 2 board members and their lawyer, and they stood well back from the machine as if it might lunge at them, and she demanded to know what I thought I was doing, and I replied calmly that I was correcting an encroachment, and that all communication should go through counsel, and that was when her voice cracked just enough to reveal fear, which confirmed what I already knew, that authority feels strongest right before it fails. They threatened to call the police again, and I welcomed that because repetition does not change outcomes when facts remain the same. And sure enough, the sheriff returned and reviewed the same documents, now augmented by the cease and desist and the deputy report and the county confirmation, and he spoke quietly with both sides before advising the HOA to step back, because this was a civil matter with clear documentation, and because interference would complicate their position, and the lawyer frowned. Because complication was the last thing they needed, and the board members whispered, because they had expected a different outcome, and that expectation gap widened visibly. While this unfolded, neighbors gathered at a respectful distance pretending to walk dogs or check mail, and I could feel the social weight of the moment pressing in, because public disputes change how people see you, and I knew some would label me difficult and others would quietly admire the stand, and neither label mattered, because land does not care about reputations, it only cares about lines, and those lines were finally about to be honored. My lawyer called with the final green light, confirming that removal of the encroaching structure was lawful provided it remained strictly within my boundary, and that the HOA had been notified and failed to act, and I thanked him, and ended the call, and walked over to the operator, who had been sitting patiently on the step drinking water, and I pointed out the true boundary markers and explained exactly where the fence crossed, and he nodded again and climbed into the cab, and the engine came to life, with a sound that cuts through indecision like a blade. The first movement was almost gentle as the bucket pressed against the fence panel and tested resistance, and the metal protested with a groan that echoed across the yards and drew a collective intake of breath from the onlookers, and the HOA president shouted something about lawsuits, but her words were swallowed by the engine noise, and I stood with my hands in my pockets feeling oddly detached, because once action begins, emotion has already done its work, and all that remains is sequence and result. Panel by panel the fence came down exactly to the true boundary line, and the operator worked with precision, lifting and setting aside the materials carefully to avoid unnecessary damage, because destruction was not the goal, correction was, and that distinction mattered more than people realized, and as the line retreated the absurdity of the original placement became obvious, because the curve returned and the land breathed again in a way only owners notice, and the HOA lawyer stopped shouting and started filming, which told me he was already planning the narrative shift from confidence to damage control. At one point a board member stepped forward and attempted to halt the operation physically, and the deputy intervened, immediately instructing him to step back, and that moment crystallized everything, because it revealed how far they were willing to go to preserve a mistake, and how little regard they had for boundaries, literal and otherwise, and the crowd murmured, and someone laughed nervously, and the power dynamic finally flipped in public view. When the last encroaching section was removed, the operator shut down the engine, and the sudden silence felt heavier than the noise had, and the true boundary stood clear and undeniable, marked by flags and pins and freshly exposed earth, and I thanked the operator and told him to wait while we documented the final state, and he smiled, because people who work with machines appreciate when their work means something, and the HOA stood frozen like actors who had missed their cue. The aftermath unfolded quickly as my lawyer sent photographs and affidavits, and the county logged the correction, and the HOA issued a statement claiming a misunderstanding, which was as close to an apology as pride allows, and neighbors dispersed carrying versions of the story that would evolve by dinner, and I stood alone again on my land watching the light change, and feeling a mix of relief and resolve, because while the fence was gone, the argument was not yet finished, it had simply moved into its final phase, where consequences are measured in meetings, resignations, and lessons learned. As evening settled, the HOA president returned alone this time, and asked quietly what I wanted, and I told her the truth, which was that I wanted my land respected, and the harassment to stop, and the record corrected, and she nodded slowly like someone recalculating the cost of stubbornness, and walked away without another word, and I realized then that the bulldozer had not finished the argument so much as clarified it, because sometimes the only way to end a dispute built on arrogance is to replace assumption with reality, and reality has a way of reshaping things permanently. The days after the fence came down felt strangely louder than the day it fell because consequences have a way of echoing, and the HOA discovered very quickly that removing a physical mistake does not erase the paper trail it leaves behind, and my mailbox filled with notices that now contradicted each other as the board scrambled to rewrite reality in real time, and every new letter only deepened the record of harassment because once you cross from enforcing rules into retaliating for embarrassment, every move becomes evidence, and I watched that happen with a calm that surprised even me because the fear that usually comes with conflict had already burned itself out and left clarity behind. The first real consequence arrived when my lawyer forwarded me a copy of a complaint filed by another homeowner citing my situation as precedent because once people see someone push back successfully, they begin to notice the pressure points in their own lives, and suddenly the HOA was not dealing with a single problem lot owner but a pattern, and patterns terrify organizations built on quiet compliance, and the board called another emergency meeting that spilled into the parking lot because attendance exceeded expectations, and I could hear raised voices even from my porch, and I knew without being there that the narrative was fracturing. I was subpoenaed as a witness in a mediation request brought by a neighbor who had been fined into silence years earlier over a shed placement that turned out to be perfectly legal, and as I prepared my statement I realized how often bullies rely on isolation to succeed, and how fragile that strategy becomes when isolation breaks, and during mediation the HOA representative avoided eye contact and spoke in generalities while documents were read aloud with dates, signatures, and inconsistencies that could not be laughed away, and when the mediator asked why corrective action had not been taken sooner, there was no answer that did not sound like arrogance. Social pressure shifted again, but this time in a different direction, as neighbors who had once whispered now stopped me openly to ask questions and to thank me quietly, and even the ones who disagreed softened, because there is something disarming about someone who stands firm without gloating, and I made a point to keep conversations factual rather than emotional, because outrage burns fast and fades but facts linger, and I wanted lingering. The HOA attempted a strategic retreat by offering to reimburse a portion of legal costs and waive all outstanding fines if I would agree not to pursue further action, and that offer was tempting in the way all incomplete justice is tempting, because it promises peace without accountability, but I declined through counsel because reimbursement without admission simply resets the clock for the next target, and I had not gone through months of pressure just to hand the lesson back unfinished. Behind closed doors the board fractured visibly as one member resigned citing personal reasons, which is the polite way to say this is no longer defensible, and another followed after emails surfaced showing he had pushed for the fence expansion despite warnings from the original surveyor, and those emails did more damage than the bulldozer ever could, because machines remove objects but documents remove credibility, and credibility once lost rarely returns. The county took notice as well and initiated a compliance review of HOA practices, which meant audits, interviews, and requests for records, and that kind of scrutiny changes behavior overnight, because suddenly every past shortcut becomes a liability, and I was asked to provide my documentation again, and each time I did so willingly because transparency was my strongest position, and watching officials frown at familiar patterns felt like validation without celebration. There was a moment one evening when the HOA president came by again, not to argue but to apologize quietly, and not on behalf of the board but on behalf of herself, and she admitted she had believed the straight-line survey because it simplified things, and because she trusted the firm without questioning the result, and I listened and thanked her for saying so, because apologies matter even when they come late, and I told her the truth, which was that simplification is often where harm begins, and she nodded like someone storing a lesson she wished she had learned sooner. The legal resolution moved steadily as my lawyer filed for damages related to harassment and trespass, not out of spite but to formalize boundaries in a way that could not be reinterpreted, and the settlement that followed included clear language about future surveys, notification requirements, and penalties for non-compliance, and it was signed quietly without ceremony, because by then everyone involved wanted the chapter closed, even if the book would remain on record. As normal life resumed, the land itself seemed to settle back into place as grass reclaimed disturbed soil, and the curve of the boundary once again felt natural and unremarkable, which is the highest compliment land can receive, and I walked it often not out of vigilance but appreciation, because ownership means more when you have defended it thoughtfully and without shortcuts. Looking back, I realized the bulldozer had been the loudest part of the story, but not the most important, because the real shift happened when documentation met patience and confidence met restraint, and an organization built on assumption met someone willing to enforce reality calmly and thoroughly. And while the HOA would recover with new leadership and revised rules, the memory of that fence and how quickly it fell would linger as a quiet warning that authority borrowed without care eventually comes due, and when it does, the bill is never just measured in feet of land, but in trust, respect, and the long, slow work of rebuilding what arrogance took for granted. What surprised me most as things settled was not the silence from the HOA, but the sudden noise from everywhere else, because once the pressure lifted, people started talking openly and stories surfaced that mirrored mine in uncomfortable ways, and I began receiving emails and knocks on the door from homeowners who had never spoken to me before and who now wanted to compare notices, surveys, and fines like survivors of the same storm, realizing they had all been standing under it alone. And I listened more than I spoke, because this was no longer about my land, but about a system that had relied on people believing resistance was pointless, and once that belief cracked, everything else followed. The HOA attempted one final maneuver that week by issuing a community-wide announcement reframing the fence incident as an unfortunate miscommunication and announcing new transparency measures, which would have been reassuring if not for the fact that the same announcement quietly blamed unnamed external influences for escalating the matter, and that subtle deflection irritated more people than it soothed, because by then, residents had seen enough documentation to recognize spin when it appeared. And the comment thread exploded into something the board could not moderate fast enough, and screenshots spread before edits could keep up, and the illusion of control slipped further. I was invited to speak at a neighborhood gathering, not an official meeting but a voluntary one held on a lawn with folding chairs and coolers, and I hesitated, because public speaking in situations like this can easily turn into spectacle, but I agreed after deciding to keep it simple and factual, and when I stood there and explained the sequence calmly without exaggeration and without attacking anyone, the mood shifted from anger to understanding, which is a much more dangerous place for bad leadership to find itself, because understanding leads to accountability and accountability leads to change. The legal process continued in parallel with depositions scheduled and documents exchanged, and during my deposition, the HOA attorney attempted to frame my actions as aggressive by focusing on the bulldozer, and I answered honestly that the machine was a tool, not a threat, and that every step had been cleared legally, and that my preference had always been for the HOA to correct its mistake voluntarily. And as I spoke, I watched his strategy falter, because aggression requires recklessness, and there had been none, only patience followed by enforcement, and that distinction mattered. One afternoon a delivery arrived addressed to me from the original surveying firm hired by the HOA, containing a revised report and a brief letter acknowledging error and offering an apology, and while the letter was carefully worded, it was significant, because professional admissions carry weight, and my lawyer smiled when he read it, because that single page closed several doors for the HOA defense and opened others for those who had been harmed previously, and I realized then how interconnected these processes are, and how one correction can ripple outward beyond its original scope. At the same time, life returned to its routines in small, comforting ways, as I fixed a section of fencing on the far side of my property, planted trees where the old posts had stood, and resumed projects that had been paused, and those ordinary acts felt like reclamation, because conflict has a way of shrinking your world down to a single issue, and reclaiming normalcy is an act of quiet defiance against that shrinkage. The HOA board reshuffled, officially announcing interim leadership and promising elections and policy reviews, and while those words had been heard before, the difference now was scrutiny, because residents were paying attention in a way they had not before, and attendance at meetings doubled and questions became sharper. And I attended one more meeting, not as an adversary, but as an observer, and watched new members speak, cautiously aware that authority now came with expectation, and that awareness alone marked progress. There was a moment of attempted intimidation that fizzled quickly when a notice appeared questioning whether my equipment usage complied with community standards, and my lawyer responded within an hour, attaching the same county confirmations that had already settled the matter, and copying the county reviewer overseeing the compliance audit, and the notice disappeared the next day without explanation, and that silence felt final in a way nothing else had, because it signaled recognition that the old tactics no longer work. Emotionally, I found myself processing the aftermath more slowly than expected, because standing your ground consumes energy even when you do it calmly, and there were evenings when I sat on the porch replaying conversations and wondering how easily this could have gone differently if I had doubted myself earlier, or if I had let frustration dictate timing, and those reflections reinforced a lesson I had learned too late in other parts of life, which is that preparation and patience are not passive. They are active disciplines that change outcomes. As weeks passed, the story settled into local lore stripped of its details, and inflated in others, and I let it, because stories belong to communities once they are shared, and my role in it was finished, and what mattered more was the structural change taking place quietly through revised bylaws, oversight committees, and a general sense that questions were now allowed where before they had been discouraged, and that shift felt more valuable than any settlement figure. The land itself continued to heal as grass thickened and the curve of the boundary faded back into visual normalcy, and visitors stopped noticing anything unusual, which was the best possible outcome, because ownership is meant to be unremarkable and secure, not constantly defended, and I felt a deep satisfaction in that ordinariness, because it meant the fight had restored balance rather than replacing one imbalance with another. By the end of the month, my lawyer confirmed that remaining matters were closing and that the record would reflect the correction permanently, and as I filed away the last document, I realized the conflict had given me something unexpected, which was a clearer understanding of how power operates in small systems, and how easily it can be checked when someone is willing to engage it thoughtfully and without fear. And as I stood on my land, watching the light shift across ground that was once again unquestionably mine, I knew the final chapter would not be about victory or defeat, but about what happens after the noise fades, and whether lessons learned are carried forward or forgotten, and that question lingered quietly waiting to be answered. The quiet that followed felt different from the earlier pauses, because this one was earned rather than forced, and as weeks turned into a month, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, where people no longer glanced toward my property expecting drama, and that absence of attention felt like a kind of victory, because true resolution rarely announces itself, it simply stops demanding energy, and I found myself reflecting on how the conflict had rewired my understanding of community, because for a long time I had thought of HOAs as either nuisances or conveniences depending on the day, but now I understood them as systems that mirror the people inside them, and systems only improve when people insist on clarity rather than comfort. I noticed small but telling changes, like meeting agendas posted earlier and minutes circulated promptly and questions answered directly instead of deflected, and while none of these things were dramatic, they signaled accountability, which is always quieter than abuse, and I watched from a distance as new board members struggled to balance authority with humility, because power learned the hard way tends to walk carefully, and that carefulness was exactly what the neighborhood needed. A few neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped by casually to chat about mundane things like weather repairs and weekend plans, and those conversations mattered more than apologies, because they marked a return to normal social gravity. And one afternoon, the neighbor who had applauded the fence originally came over with a six-pack and admitted he had assumed the HOA knew what it was doing, and that assumption had cost him trust in his own judgment, and we talked honestly about how easy it is to confuse confidence with correctness, and he left lighter than he arrived, which told me the story had given others permission to rethink their own deference. The county review concluded publicly with a summary that cited procedural failures and recommended oversight measures, and while the report was clinical, it carried weight, and the HOA accepted it without protest, which was perhaps the clearest sign of change, because acceptance requires humility and humility rarely survives unchecked authority, and I filed the report away knowing I would likely never need it again, and hoping sincerely that was true. On a personal level, I felt the tension unwind slowly because standing firm for months leaves its mark even when you do it calmly, and there were moments when a simple email notification made my chest tighten out of habit, and it took time to trust that the crisis had passed, and during that time I focused on restoring the parts of life that had been sidelined, like finishing projects, reconnecting with friends, and allowing myself to enjoy the land again without scanning it for intrusion. I planted a line of native trees along the restored boundary, not as a barrier but as a reminder of the curve that had been erased and returned, and as I worked I thought about how disputes often flatten nuance in pursuit of simplicity, and how restoration requires reintroducing complexity patiently, and those trees would take years to mature, which felt appropriate because trust grows at the same pace. The HOA reached out formally to ask if I would be willing to review a draft of revised boundary procedures given my experience, and I agreed on the condition that my role be advisory only and unpaid, because influence should not be mistaken for control, and when I read the draft I saw echoes of past mistakes softened by lessons learned, and I offered comments focused on transparency, documentation, and notice, and they were accepted without resistance, which confirmed that the culture had shifted, at least for now. As summer approached, the story faded from daily conversation and became something referenced occasionally with a shake of the head or a wry smile, and that fading felt healthy because communities cannot thrive on constant conflict, and even caution needs room to relax, and I realized that my own role was to let go rather than linger, because staying vigilant too long can turn into suspicion, and suspicion is just another form of tension. There was one final interaction that brought unexpected closure when the former HOA president stopped by unannounced and asked if we could walk the property line together, and as we did she pointed out where she had first assumed the straight line made sense, and where she now saw the flaw in that thinking, and she apologized again, not defensively but thoughtfully, and I accepted it fully because forgiveness is easiest when learning is evident, and we parted amicably like two people released from a role neither wanted anymore. In the evenings I sat on the porch watching the light shift across land that felt whole again, and I thought about how conflicts often force clarity, not just about the issue at hand but about values and boundaries and self-trust, and I recognized that the bulldozer had been a symbol not of aggression but of finality, and that finality allowed everything else to recalibrate and find balance. As the season changed, the trees took root, the grass thickened, and the memory of the fence receded into the background of experience, rather than dominating it, and I felt a quiet gratitude for the outcome, not because it had been easy, but because it had been fair, and fairness is rare enough to be cherished, and as I prepared to close this chapter of my life, I knew the next would not be defined by conflict, but by the absence of it, which is the most underrated success of all. By the time everything truly ended, it did not end with a letter or a meeting or a dramatic statement, but with an ordinary morning, where I walked the boundary without thinking about it at all, and that was how I knew it was finished, because peace announces itself through forgetfulness, and I found myself more focused on the sound of wind in the trees I had planted, and the way the ground felt solid underfoot, than on any memory of conflict, and that shift was the real resolution, because the fight had never been about winning, it had been about restoring something that should never have been questioned in the first place, and once restored it no longer demanded attention. The HOA elections came and went quietly, with turnout higher than usual and candidates speaking carefully about stewardship and limits and process, and while I did not attend the meeting, I read the minutes later, and noticed how often words like transparency and verification appeared, and I smiled, because language reflects priorities, and priorities shape behavior, and behavior determines whether systems protect people or pressure them, and it felt good knowing the lesson had embedded itself where it mattered. A letter arrived from the county confirming the closure of the review and noting that updated procedures had been filed and acknowledged, and that letter went into the same box as the original deed and survey because beginnings and endings belong together, and as I closed the lid, I felt a sense of completion that did not require celebration because closure does not need an audience. Neighbors continued living their lives, and the story became a reference point rather than a wound, and occasionally someone new to the area would ask about the trees along the boundary, and I would explain simply that there used to be a fence where it did not belong, and that explanation was enough, and did not invite debate, because the truth had settled into the soil along with the roots, and required no defense. On a practical level, the settlement funds covered the legal costs and allowed me to invest in improvements that had been postponed, and I upgraded drainage, repaired an old outbuilding, and finally finished a project I had been dreaming about since moving in, and those tangible outcomes felt appropriate because conflict had delayed progress and resolution allowed it to resume, and there was a satisfying symmetry in that. Emotionally, I noticed a change in how I approached potential friction elsewhere because the experience had recalibrated my tolerance for ambiguity and taught me that addressing issues early calmly and thoroughly prevents them from metastasizing, and that knowledge carried forward into work, friendships, and other parts of life where boundaries matter just as much, even when they are not measured in feet and inches. One evening I sat with a friend who had followed the situation from afar, and he asked if I would do anything differently knowing how it played out, and I thought carefully before answering because hindsight often flatters certainty, and I told him the truth, which was that I would still choose patience over provocation and documentation over drama, and that the bulldozer would still arrive only when all other options were exhausted and justified. And he nodded because that answer made sense, not because it was dramatic, but because it was disciplined. The land itself became the final teacher as seasons passed and growth covered the last visible traces of disruption, and the curve of the boundary blended seamlessly into the landscape again, and visitors no longer noticed anything unusual, which was exactly the point, and I took comfort in that invisibility, because the best outcomes rarely draw attention to themselves, they simply allow life to continue uninterrupted. There was a moment months later when a new HOA board member stopped by to ask a routine question about a utility easement, and she arrived with maps, documents, and advance notice, and as we reviewed everything together calmly and efficiently, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, because that interaction represented the future that had been fought for, not through slogans but through standards, and it was proof that systems can learn when confronted with reality rather than protected by denial. As time went on, the phrase people used when referencing the incident shifted from that fence problem to that lesson, and language like that matters because problems invite repetition while lessons invite application, and I realized that the real impact extended beyond my property and into the collective memory of the community, and that impact would likely prevent conflicts I would never hear about, and that unseen prevention felt like the most meaningful outcome of all. Standing on the porch one evening watching the light fade, I reflected on how easily this could have ended differently if I had doubted my records or allowed intimidation to rush me or sought validation through noise rather than evidence, and I felt grateful for the quiet confidence that had guided each step, because confidence grounded in preparation does not need to shout and rarely needs to apologize. In the end, the bulldozer did finish the argument, but not by destroying something out of anger, rather by enforcing a truth that had been ignored, and making space for correction, and once that correction was complete, the machine left the same way it arrived, leaving behind no scars, only clarity, and as I watched the last light disappear behind the trees, I understood that the story had never really been about a fence or an HOA, but about the simple enduring power of knowing where you stand and being willing to defend it patiently until the world catches up and recognizes it too.